On the first heavy snowfall of winter, Tomas hid a wounded orc in his barn. No questions asked, nothing demanded in return. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know his own king had ordered her death, and that sheltering that stranger was about to cost him everything he had. There are three kinds of snow: the kind that falls soft and erases tracks, the kind that comes sideways and cuts your face like ground glass, and the heavy snow, the kind that falls straight down, quiet, unhurried, as if the sky had finally decided to bury everything underneath it once and for all. It was that third kind. Tomas knew, because he had been awake since before the rooster. He woke like that since the winter martyr died, not all at once, but slowly, like someone losing count of the days when there was still someone on the other side of the bed. At 4 in the morning, the silence of the house had a specific weight. He had learned not to fight it. He put on his mended boots, his worn wool coat, and went out to check on Fig, the old donkey who coughed more than he should in the cold. His breath came out in short clouds as he crossed the covered yard. The snow had already swallowed the planting furrows. In 2 months those furrows would need to exist again, ready for the rye. For now, they were white ghosts. He was on his way back when he saw the dark shape at the edge of the road. First thought, animal, too large for a fox, wrong for a deer. The second thought came when he got closer and saw the green skin beneath the frozen mud, the pointed ears sunk into the snow, the flank, God above, the flank. The wound was from an axe. He knew axe wounds because he had been called once to help carry an injured woodcutter, and the shape was unmistakable, deep, vertical, the lips of skin pulled apart like an open mouth. But what surrounded it was worse. Strips of barbed wire coiled into the flesh, twisted as though someone had pulled part of it free, failed, and given up. There was ice in the wire. The orc was breathing. Barely. Tomas stood still for a time he couldn't have measured. He knew what the village would do. Benedict had already reported 2 creatures found on the road: a goblin with a sack of spices no one asked about, and once an elf who seemed ill and was never seen again. In silver, an adult orc was worth far more, especially one with bearing like this, arms that Tomas recognized as arms that knew how to work, and even unconscious there was something in the line of her face that wasn't animal. It was just different. He didn't go to fetch anyone. He went back to the barn, took the blacksmith's pliers from the second hook on the left, and returned to the roadside. He knelt in the snow, placed his gloved hands on the first coil of wire, and began. She groaned once when he pulled the second piece free. Her eyes opened slightly, yellow, like the yolk of a farm egg, like amber when the light hit them right, and then closed again. Tomas kept working. There was nothing to say. The work said it for him. It took 40 minutes to carry her to the barn, stopping 3 times because she was heavier than anything he had carried in years. Fig backed away at first, then settled quietly in the corner, the way old animals do when they decide a stranger isn't a threat. Just one more thing the world brought along that can't be helped. Tomas boiled cloth in the small pot, cleaned the wound with sour wine, the only kind he had, too bad to drink, but good for this. Bound it tight. He took the bone broth left over from dinner, still warm, and when she woke enough to swallow, he held the bowl. She drank without fully opening her eyes. No agreement was made, no payment was promised. Tomas put out the lantern, covered her with Fig's spare blanket, the only extra he had, and went back to the empty house. Outside, the snow kept falling. The third kind, the kind that buries everything. There is a contract older than any wax-sealed paper, the contract of roof and bread. It isn't written in any book of law because it didn't need to be. Anyone who has ever gone hungry knows that sharing the last slice isn't generosity. It is recognition. It is saying, I see you, you exist. For 3 days, she didn't speak. Tomas learned her rhythm the way he learned the rhythm of weather, by watching. In the mornings she woke with fever, her forehead hot as a summer stone. By afternoon the fever dropped, and she lay with her eyes open, tracking every movement he made in the barn, without moving her head. At night she slept deeply, her breathing carrying a faint rasp underneath. Not dangerous, but constant, like a reminder. He changed the bandage every morning before the rooster crowed. He had learned from Marta that clean wounds heal, hidden wounds rot. She never reacted to his touch. She stayed absolutely still, with a discipline that Tomas recognized as training, not numbness. Someone had taught that woman to bear pain without showing it. On the fourth day she spoke. He was pouring broth into the bowl when he heard a voice, low and dry as a dead leaf. "Why?" Tomas turned. She was looking at him directly for the first time, yellow eyes fixed on his, no hostility, but with an intensity that made the question weigh more than one word has any right to. He thought for a moment, scratched the back of his neck. "It was cold out there," he said, and handed her the bowl. She stared at him for another second, then accepted the bowl with both hands. She had long fingers, with calluses on the knuckles that Tomas recognized. They were the calluses of someone who had gripped tool handles for years, not someone who held a sword. That surprised him, but he said nothing. "Zura," she said after a while. She tapped her closed fist lightly against her own chest. "I am Zura. Tomas," he answered, with the same gesture, without thinking. She looked at the gesture. Something moved at the corner of her mouth, not a smile, the memory of one. In the days that followed, the language was built brick by brick, like a wall neither of them had planned to raise, but that kept going up regardless. She knew fragments of the human tongue, enough to understand more than she let on. He learned that when she tapped two fingers into her palm, she meant wait. That when she said Vashkara and looked at him directly, she was saying something he would only understand later. That it meant, "I trust." The hardest word to teach in any language. One cold afternoon she stood for the first time. Tomas was mending Fig's harness when he heard the sound of straw being pressed underfoot. She was standing, braced against the stall post, testing the weight on her wounded flank with the expression of someone running an internal calculation. He stayed still, pliers in hand, waiting. She took 3 steps, stopped, breathed deep, took 2 more. "Don't push it," he said. "I need to know how much I have," she answered. It was the longest sentence she had said, and Tomas understood she wasn't talking about the wound. That night, while the wind struck the barn boards with the sound of open palms, she sat with her back against the wall, and he sat 3 paces away, and both of them stayed in silence for a full hour. It was the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. Tomas hadn't felt that since before Marta died. Sometimes what heals isn't the right word. It's the right presence, at the right moment, asking nothing in return. War has its own grammar. Subject, whoever gives orders. Verb, kill. Object, whoever is inconvenient. What never appears in that grammar are names. Names are what turn war into murder, and murder into shame. That is why kings are so careful with names. Tomas didn't ask where she had come from. He didn't ask what had happened, who had made the cut. Why there was barbed wire inside an axe wound. The kind of detail that suggests someone wanted to make sure the wound wouldn't close, that someone had thought about suffering with the same attention a craftsman gives his own work. He didn't ask because there are things that, once spoken, change the air of a place forever. Zura noticed. "You don't want to know," she said one morning. During the second week, as he changed the bandage, there was visible improvement. The skin around the wound had closed enough to hold the cloth without bleeding. "I do," he said, eyes on his work, "but I don't need to." She was quiet for a long moment. "There's a difference," she said at last. "Yes." He tied the knot, adjusted it. "Wanting means I'm curious. Not needing means what you tell me or don't tell me doesn't change what I do." He looked at her. "I've already done what I did. There's no taking that back." Zura looked at him with that intensity he had learned to recognize, not as threat, but as assessment, like someone who had been deceived many times and had developed the habit of reading people before deciding what to do with them. "You are a strange man, Tomas," she said. "Probably," he agreed, and went to fetch the thin morning coffee. She told him anyway. Not all at once, in pieces, over the days that followed, as though testing the weight of each word before setting it out loud, that there was a treaty, that it had been signed 3 generations back in silver and blood between orcs and humans, meant to end a war that had lasted so long people had forgotten the original reason, that she, as heir to the lineage that had signed on the orc side, carried the right to invoke the treaty, that the current king profited from the war in specific and numerous ways, and that a peace treaty was, to him, a more dangerous enemy than any army, that her own counselor had handed her over in exchange for land. Tomas listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, then said, "The counselor. Varus?" She had mentioned the name once, in passing. Varus. She let the name sit in the air for a moment. "He taught me to read. He taught me the languages of the peoples the treaty reached, including yours. He taught me that leaders who don't listen eventually find themselves with no one left to listen to. I spent 20 years believing he believed what he taught me." "Maybe he did," said Tomas. She looked at him. "Sometimes," he continued, weighing the words, "a person can believe everything they taught you and still do what he did. Not because it was a lie, but because, when the moment came, the cost of honoring it was too high." Zura was quiet for a long time. "That is worse," she said at last. "It is," he agreed, "but it's more honest." The wind hit hard against the boards. Fig shifted in his stall. The 2 hens slept the way hens sleep, which is deeply and with complete indifference to the human drama around them. "Does the treaty still exist somewhere?" he asked. "It does. It's kept somewhere." She made a vague gesture. "But a document with no one to invoke it is just paper, and She looked at her own hands. "I don't know yet if I'm someone who can invoke it. I needed to know first whether I was still alive." "You are," he said. It was obvious, but she closed her eyes briefly as though she needed to hear it. Some truths only heal when spoken aloud, by someone who cares enough to say them. Love, if that word applies, and perhaps it applies in ways poets haven't yet found verses for, rarely begins with a declaration. It begins with someone noticing a loose board and nailing it without being asked. It begins with a bowl set beside someone without a word. It begins with the decision, repeated every day, to show up. In the 3rd week, Zura started working. Tomas arrived at the barn one morning to find the roof repaired, 3 boards that had been loose since autumn that he had been putting off fixing because wood cost money and time always ran short. She had found the spare planks he kept against the back wall, found the nails in the rusted tin, and done the work with a precision that suggested it wasn't the first time. He looked up for a long time. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know," she said. She was sitting feeding the hens, who had decided, with the pragmatic indifference of hens, that she was acceptable. "That's why I did." Thomas began to understand that acts of service were Zura's effective grammar, the way she said things she didn't yet have words for. The following week, she sharpened all the barn tools with a stone she had found in the frozen stream, testing the edge with her thumb with the focus of a surgeon. She fixed the front door latch that had been jamming for months. She started carrying water from the well in the morning without anyone asking, leaving the buckets in the exact spot where Tomas would pick them up. He answered the only way he knew. He kept showing up. He brought coffee earlier. He left the larger bread slice on her side without comment. On a biting afternoon, he came back from the village with a piece of thick wool cloth he had traded 2 eggs for, more than he could afford, and left it folded on the bench without a word. When she looked at him, he had already turned back to his work. There was an afternoon when he was mending the back fence and she came to help. They worked side by side for 2 hours in the cold, she holding the posts while he hammered, he holding the wire while she twisted. They didn't talk much. Sometimes he noticed her looking at her own hands with an expression he couldn't name, as if she were remembering that she had hands, that hands could do things that weren't holding a sword or signing a document. "You like working with your hands," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "I was taught that it was. Lesser, that heirs don't carry firewood." "Whoever taught you that never carried firewood," he said. She let out a sound that was half laugh, half exhale, the first sound close to laughter she had made since arriving. It was a small sound, but in the silence of the winter field, it rang like something breaking in a good way. At night, when the cold got serious and the wind came from the north with intention, Tomas had started the habit of bringing the small brazier into the barn. It wasn't necessary. She had proved she could handle cold. It was simply another way of saying what hadn't yet been said, with words. She never mentioned the gesture, but one night when he came in with the brazier, there was a cup of the herb tea she had found growing under the snow, bitter, strange, but warm, waiting on the bench where he always sat. Some stories don't begin in the heart. They begin in the hands, and they reach the heart all the same. Small villages have a collective memory that works like an archive and a court at the same time. Everything is registered. Not everything is said. The silence of a community can be complicity, or it can be cruelty. Sometimes it is both on the same day, depending on who is asking. The village knew. Not all of them, and not with certainty, but the kind of diffuse knowing that forms when someone sees a light in a barn at strange hours, when one man's rubbish starts including more used bandages than any farm injury would justify, when Tomas buys wool in the dead of winter, having last purchased cloth on his wedding day. The first to say something was old Imelda, who was 70 years old, had arthritis in both hands and the sharpest tongue in the village. She waited for Tomas outside the supply store on an afternoon when the sky was the color of old iron. "I hear you have a guest," she said, without preamble. "I do," he said, not looking away. She studied him for a moment with eyes that had seen a great many things, and had decided at some point in life not to pretend they hadn't. "What kind of guest?" she said. It wasn't a question. "The kind that needed a roof and a bandage," he said. "The kind that hasn't done a thing to anyone in this village." Old Imelda was quiet for a time that could have gone either way. Then she said, in the voice she used when closing a subject, "The community oven is lit tomorrow morning. If you need to bake bread, it's a good day." That was it. That was the village saying through Imelda that it knew and had decided, at least for now, not to know out loud. Not everyone was like that. Benedict, who had reported the creatures before, and who wore the permanent expression of a man who believes the world owes him something, had been watching Tomas's barn with growing attention. He had asked questions at the supply store that no one answered directly. He had sent his oldest son to spy on the road twice. Tomas knew this. One afternoon, Zura said she had heard footsteps outside the barn the night before. "Too heavy for a fox," she said. "I know who it was," he said. Is it danger? Tomas thought. Benedict was frightened above all else, frightened of reprisals, frightened of losing what little he had, frightened of taking sides with the side that might lose. As long as the situation looked like no one from the crown was coming, Benedict would stay quiet, because denouncing cost something, and cost frightened Benedict. "For now, no," he said, "but that can change." "When?" "When someone shows up paying more than staying quiet would cost." Zura nodded. There was something in her eyes in that moment that was old, not the oldness of years, but the oldness of someone who learned very early how the world works and had never managed to unlearn it. "I should go," she said, not with urgency, as a statement of fact, "before I bring trouble down on you." "That's not your decision to make," he said. She looked at him, surprised. "It isn't your call," he repeated, calm. "You are under my roof. While you are, it's my concern. When you decide to leave, you'll leave, but not because I sent you away." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Why do you do this?" she said. It wasn't the same question as the fourth day. That one had been about the act. This one was about the pattern. He considered honestly. "I think I'm tired," he said, "of living in a world where what is right and what is convenient are never the same thing, and of choosing convenient anyway. Sometimes resistance isn't a grand gesture. It is simply a man who quietly decided to stop bending. There are stories that can't be told in daylight. The light makes them small, makes them facts, makes them things to be assessed and judged. At night, around a fire, a story is only what it is. One person's attempt to make another understand where they came from. It was on a night of strong wind, when the barn groaned like a ship, that Zura told the full story. Not the summary she had given before. The structure, the facts, the real story, the one that lay beneath the facts, the way earth lies beneath snow, dark, dense, and the place where things either grow or die. The treaty was signed by my great-grandmother as she began. Her name was Zura, too. It is a name for those who carry things. Tomas sat with his back against the barn wall, cup in both hands. He said nothing. The war had lasted 60 years. 60 years is long enough for children born inside it to grow up and have children who also know only war. They become who they are inside the war. Peace, to them, looks like a threat, because peace would mean everything they lost and did was optional. She stared into the brazier. My great-grandmother understood that, which is why she didn't negotiate the treaty as a victory. She negotiated it as a pause, as the decision to stop bleeding together and see what grows when the bleeding stops. "Did it work?" he asked. "For 3 generations it worked." Something in her voice grew heavier. "It worked enough that I grew up not knowing the smell of a battlefield, that I learned more about farming than about military strategy. My tutor taught me crop rotation before he taught me tactics. I thought that was normal, that the world had changed. But it hadn't. It hadn't. I was the proof that it had changed, and for that reason it was convenient that I no longer exist." She said this with a serenity that Thomas found more disturbing than anger would have been. Anger means the wound is still open. That serenity was the serenity of someone who had reached the far bank of a pain and was describing the crossing. "The counselor," he said. "Varus." She had mentioned the name once, in passing. Varus. She let the name sit in the air for a moment. "He taught me to read. He taught me the languages of the peoples the treaty covered, including yours. He taught me that leaders who don't listen eventually find themselves with no one to lead. I spent 20 years believing he believed what he taught me." "Maybe he did," said Tomas. She looked at him. "Sometimes," he continued, weighing the words carefully, "a person can believe everything they taught you and still do what he did, not because it was a lie, but because, when the moment came, the price of honoring it was too high." Zura was quiet for a long time. "That is worse," she said at last. "Yes," he agreed, "but it's more honest." The wind hit hard against the boards. Fig shifted in his stall. The 2 hens slept the way hens sleep, deeply and with complete indifference to the human drama unfolding around them. "Does the treaty still exist somewhere?" he asked. "It does. It's kept." She made a vague gesture. "But a document with no one to invoke it is just paper, and I—" She looked at her own hands. "I don't know yet if I am someone who can invoke it. I needed to know first if I was still alive." "You are," he said. It was obvious, but she closed her eyes briefly, as though she had needed to hear it. The wind pushed hard against the barn, and the lantern flame bent sideways and then straightened, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Outside, somewhere in the dark, the first frost of deep winter crept across the fields and made them white and silent and waiting. Some truths only heal when spoken aloud, by someone who cares enough to say them. War announces itself in specific ways, not with trumpets. Trumpets are for battles, and battles are between equals. The war against a single person, against a single idea, arrives quietly, with the sound of horseshoes on frozen ground and the voice of a man who knows he won't find resistance. Tomas heard the horses before he saw anything. It was early morning, the kind of morning when frost coats everything in a thin layer of crystal that crackles under every step. He was in the yard when he heard the rhythm of hooves, not one or two horses, but more, much more. He stopped with the water bucket in his hand and listened, calculating. Zura appeared in the gap of the barn door. She had heard it too. Their eyes met. "How many?" she said quietly. From the sound. 8, 10 horses. He set the bucket down. "Get inside." "Tomas, get inside and stay quiet." It wasn't an order from someone with authority. It was the voice of someone who had just made a decision and needed the other person to trust him while he carried it out. She went inside. He stayed in the yard. The soldiers came down the main road, 10 horses as he had calculated, wearing the king's insignia on their surcoats, with swords that hadn't been drawn but were being worn in the specific language of swords that want to be noticed. At the front of them, on horseback but without armor, was Lord Aldrich, the landowner who held Tomas's debt and 6 others in the village, a man who had developed the skill of smiling in ways that never reached his eyes. "Tomas," said Aldrich, with the cordiality of someone with 10 swords behind him, "a cold morning." "It is," said Tomas. "These men are conducting a search authorized by the king." Aldrich made a gesture that was half apology, half threat. "There are reports of a fugitive orc in this area. Dangerous. Wanted for crimes against the crown." "Never heard of one." Aldrich looked at him with eyes that were running the calculation of how much that lie cost and how much it would cost to let it pass. "They'll need to see your barn and outbuildings," he said. "They won't," said Tomas. The silence that followed had physical weight. One of the soldiers moved his horse slightly forward. The commander, a middle-aged man with a scar on his chin and the expression of someone who had carried out unpleasant orders before and had learned not to think too hard about it, looked at Tomas with the assessment of someone measuring an obstacle. "Farmer," said the commander in the voice that came from above, from high on the horse, "you are obstructing a search authorized by royal law. That is a crime. It's only a crime if I'm hiding something," said Tomas. He picked up the hoe leaning against the fence. Not as a weapon, just because his hands needed something to hold. "But if you want to break down that door, you'll have to move me out of the way first." "That can be arranged," said the commander. "It can," Tomas agreed. "But it'll make noise." And the noise had already started, because old Imelda was standing at her doorway. Behind her, the blacksmith in his still-tied apron, the baker with flour still on his hands, old Mateo, who had lost 2 sons in the war the king called necessary, one by one, with no prior arrangement, no speech, no leader, simply people who had stepped out of their doors and stood where they were. The commander looked at the scene. Aldrich looked at the scene. Tomas stood with the hoe. There are moments when power encounters something it cannot buy and doesn't quite know how to destroy, people who have simply decided to stop getting out of the way. There are laws that kings write, and there are laws that kings didn't write because they didn't need to, because they were already there. Written in the collective memory of everyone who had ever needed shelter on a stormy night and found it. The hospitality code has no articles or clauses. It has only the simple understanding that whoever eats your bread and sleeps under your roof is under your protection. To break that is not illegality, it is something worse. "By the old code of hospitality," said Tomas, in a voice that neither rose nor trembled. "She is under my roof and has eaten my bread. That is guessed right." The commander looked at him with the expression of someone deciding whether to laugh or order the charge. "The old code," he said, in a tone that turned the words into a joke, "is not recognized under current Crown law." "It doesn't need to be recognized by the Crown," said old Imelda. From her doorway, the voice of 70 years, of a woman who had buried a husband and children and was still standing. "It needs to be recognized by us." The blacksmith took a step forward. He said nothing. He simply stood beside Tomas. The baker did the same. Old Mathieu, slowly, with legs that were no longer what they once were, crossed the yard and took his place. Behind him was a young man, Mathieu's youngest son, who had never known the brothers lost to war, but who had grown up watching what the war had done to his father and had drawn his own conclusions. Aldrich was running the calculation. It was visible on his face. 10 armed soldiers against a village of 20 people, 30 with the women now coming out of doorways too. In open combat, 10 armed soldiers would win easily. But this wasn't open combat. This was a village standing at its own front door, and there was a difference between crushing an armed resistance and massacring farmers in their own yard. That difference had a name: accounts, testimony, the possibility that word would reach other lords who were already starting to question why they paid so much to a crown that delivered so little. The commander turned to Aldrich. Aldrich said nothing for a time that lasted an eternity. Then the barn door opened. Zura stepped out alone. Tomas turned to her with an expression that tried to be a command and became something between shock and the beginning of terror. She looked at him, and there was something in her eyes. Calm, a deliberate and absolute calm, like someone about to do the most frightening thing of their life and who had decided to do it standing up. She was standing. The wound still limited her. There was a stiffness on the left side that Thomas recognized from weeks of dressings, but she was standing, spine straight, with that bearing he had noticed from the very first, and that now made a different kind of sense. "I am Zura, daughter of the green blood," she said. The voice came out different, projected, with a resonance she hadn't used in the barn. The voice of someone trained to be heard. Heir to the Treaty of Iron and Silver, signed in the 3rd generation by the blood of 2 nations. The commander did not laugh this time. "You may arrest me," she continued. "You may take me. You may do what your king commanded." She looked at the villagers, at Tomas, and there was something in her gaze that was both farewell and gratitude. "But before you do, I want you to look at these men and women, not to decide whether you can beat them, to decide whether you can look at them afterward. The law is what the powerful right to make convenient what is cowardly." She didn't raise her voice. She said it with the same clarity of someone listing facts. The old code was written by everyone who has ever gone hungry, everyone who has ever needed a roof, everyone who has ever been a stranger in a land that was not their own. It has no king. It has only people who remember what it means to be human. The silence after that lasted. The commander looked at the villagers, at Tomas, at Aldrich. Aldrich looked away. "Move out," said the commander at last. "Nothing here. There are victories that appear on no battle map. They are the hardest to win and the only ones that last. Family is not what blood decides. Blood is only the beginning of a list of options. Family is what is left after you take away everything that was obligation, everything that was convention, everything that was fear. What remains after that, if anything remains, is choice. And choice is the only thing in the world no one can take from you without your permission. Spring arrived the way it always does, without announcing itself, without asking permission, with the smell of wet earth that is the oldest smell there is. Zura stayed. It wasn't a decision made with words, it was a decision made with actions, which is how real decisions work. On the day the ice on the road had thawed enough to travel, Tomas had half expected her to gather what little she had and say she was leaving. She had gone to the field with him to haul manure for the planting. They worked in silence for hours. At the end of the afternoon, when the sun was still low but there was enough light to see steam rising from the thawing earth, Tomas stopped and looked at the field that had been furrows and was now the possibility of rye and potatoes, and said, "Do you have nowhere to go right now, or are you choosing to stay?" She was quiet for a moment, leaning on the hoe. "Both," she said, "which is why staying isn't weakness." He nodded. "I need another pair of arms," he said. "The farm is more than one man can manage, and the barn roof needs attention in the summer, before the rains come." "I know carpentry," she said. "I know you do. I want to learn to read weather from the clouds. You know how to do that." "You learn fast." It was the strangest agreement either of them had ever made. No silver changed hands. No document was signed. There were 2 furrows that needed to be dug tomorrow morning, and a fence giving way on the north side, and a donkey that coughed, and 2 hens that needed a better henhouse. There was enough work for 2 people, and 2 people who had discovered, over a winter of bandages and broth and shared silences, that each other's company was the closest thing to rest that either of them had felt in a very long time. The treaty still existed somewhere. The war continued in the distance. Tomas heard it sometimes in the supply store, the kind of news that arrived in fragments and that added up to a picture nobody wanted to look at directly. Zura heard it too, and there were nights when he saw in her eyes the weight of carrying a name that had consequences, a right that still existed on paper, and asked something of her she hadn't yet decided if she could give. But there were also the mornings. There was the morning she appeared with the bitter herb tea that had become habit, and he appeared with the bread he had learned to bake better because there was someone to bake it for. There was the afternoon he was teaching her the difference between a rain cloud and a hail cloud, and she stood with her brow slightly furrowed in the concentration of someone learning a new language, the language of weather, of earth, of things that grow if you know how to listen. There was the night Tomas walked past the barn door and saw that she had placed on a makeshift shelf 3 objects: a smooth river stone, a bent nail she had found in the field, and the first flower that had opened in the yard that spring, dried now but kept. Neither of them mentioned it, but he understood it was her way of saying, "I have a place here. This is my place here." He placed beside her 3 objects: the blacksmith's pliers, the ones that had pulled the wire free, the ones that had started everything. She saw it. He saw her see it. There was no declaration. There were no words for it. Or perhaps there were, but they were still being invented, the way all words for things that didn't exist before they happened are invented. In the field, the rye was beginning to push through. Fig had stopped coughing, the hens had a new henhouse, and Tomas, who had spent 2 winters talking to plants because there was no one else, woke one April morning to the sound of someone already up and working in the yard, and lay still for a moment just listening to that sound, the sound of another person existing near you, and felt something in his chest that he had forgotten the name of, but whose name was hope. The power that comes from gold can buy armies, but it cannot buy the man who stands in the barn doorway holding a hoe. It cannot buy the woman who walks out of that barn with her spine straight and her voice trained to be heard, and uses it, perhaps for the first time, to protect instead of being protected. It cannot buy the villagers who stepped out of their doorways with no prior arrangement, no speech, nothing but the quiet decision that there were things that were not going to happen while they were standing there to see. Blood makes you an orc. Pain makes you human. But choosing to build, choosing to show up every day with the bandage and the broth and the work and the silence that says more than any speech, that is what makes you a family.